we would only be able to logically conclude that those who are weak and sick should be executed by the strong and the healthy. And this particular origin explanation of who are we from and why are we all here means that not all people are equal. The only conclusion that someone who holds to this particular view, that evolution is the reason that we are all here, and that ultimately we came from gas, is that you would have to say, some of us who walk upright on this earth are superior to others of us who walk upright on this earth. To say it in more plain terms, if you believe that who we came from is gas through a random death spiral that has brought this great grand world into being, you must be a racist. And your explanation for where are all the people from is they either are greater examples of the evolutionary process, or they are lesser examples of the evolutionary process. Ergo, some of us are superior to others of us. I just would make sure very clearly that if you were a Christian and you were entertaining evolution as something that could integrate with the Christian faith to explain who you're from and who everybody else is from, number one, you have the Bible to deal with, which is a major issue. But number two, you just need to understand that you ultimately have no reason for any moral standing on anything whatsoever. And the only thing that you could consistently view to be your moral obligation would be that you survive. That's one explanation of who are we from and where are all these people from. Those who believe such things should, in one sense, you could take Margaret Sanger. You could look at what she did with Planned Parenthood. You could read about her life. You could read about her views. You could read about her enterprises in the world. And I would suggest to you, there is a perfect, consistent portrait of what she believed about the origins of human beings. And the reason that she absolutely hated black-skinned people on the earth was because of her explanation of where are we from, who are we from. And the reason that she could concoct of such a thing as Planned Parenthood that would systematically bring the extinction of lesser so-called species of human beings is because of her answer to the question, where are we from and whom are we from? If you are a racist and you believe that some human beings are superior to other human beings, you need to understand you are fundamentally contrary to the Christian faith. Because in Genesis chapter 10 in the table of nations, we learn all nations come from Noah's 3 sons. And by the time we get to the end of chapter 11, none of them fear God and walk in his ways. And the only hope for all peoples is the one man God chooses from one man's family, who's from the line of Shem. So, somewhat boring, Genesis 10 and 11 may be in our annual Bible reading. You get to these names of these generations, and we begin to pronounce strange names, and you can laugh at my attempt to pronounce some of them, but it is so important that you know who you are from, that you know where everybody else is from, so that you can know that indeed the hope of the nations rests in the promise God made to Abraham. See, Scripture gives another explanation to the question of who are we from. Scripture gives another answer to the question about the origin of the peoples. Sometimes we'll call them the nations. Peoples on the earth do not come from a chaotic, random, pointless beginning, but rather they are due to the eternal and infinite triune God who was pleased to create all things and did so, who made Adam and Eve to know him and to enjoy him. He made the place so that he would bless them with all good things, especially his own presence there in the Garden of Eden. And he commissioned them to multiply and fill the earth so that his image would be born in men and women and boys and girls throughout the face of the earth. Indeed, being from Adam in the garden means that you have intrinsic dignity and value because you are God's image bearer. See, it really does matter who we are from. If we are made by God, if we are thus made for his purposes and God designed us and outfitted us for them, then the idea that we would be evolved from hydrogen gas and a random, godless, unexplained divine first cause would absolutely steal any dignity to mankind. But it also would remove any moral obligation of mankind to God. See, Genesis has presented to us that God is the one who made man to bless man. And everything that we see God doing is that God is giving mankind good blessings in the land that God has made for them. We saw that very clearly in the beginning, but after the flood, what did God give to Noah? The same blessings from the land, and restated the same mission that he gave to Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And Noah and his sons and their wives had the same position that Adam had, and that is that they ruled over all the earth, that they were to use it for the sustenance and advance of mankind. But we've also seen in Genesis that the constant problem with mankind fallen from our original states in the garden is that we do not want to receive God's blessing and we do not want to use it for God's purposes. We see constantly in Genesis that through unbelief and disobedience, we choose to do what we want and we do not yield to what God made us for. We've seen it with Adam. We've seen it with Cain. We've seen it with Noah. And now we are going to see it. It now will permeate through all the nations. Because in Genesis 10, Noah's sons, 3 of them, divide into the nations of the world. See, the context of the Bible, in one sense, is given to us in Genesis 10 and 11. To be able to understand what you'll read after Genesis 11 requires that you understand what we must read in Genesis 10 and 11. And that is that there are many peoples that are around this scattered globe who indeed have the same origin. But they do not all know of the blessing of redemption, for God chooses one man to enter into a covenant relationship that includes a promise that all the nations will be blessed from his seed. But we therefore need to understand, not only to read the Bible, but also to understand our own world. Where do all the different people come from? Where do the people with more melanin in their skin so that they look good when they get sun? And then others of us who don't have melanin like they do, I mean, you look pretty nasty when you get into too much sun. Like, why is that? Where did you come from? Like, why do some people have this type of hair and others have this type of hair? Why are some built in this way and others built in this way? Like, there's certain easy ways that we are able to explain. We're all, at least, though, here today from different places. And those differences are manifest in our bodies and features that are outward. What you also add, while not necessarily that true in our church here this morning, we all don't speak the same. The history of the world is not only different looking people in different places, but they talk differently. And I don't just mean in the way that Yankees talk compared to the way the rest of us who speak appropriately, but rather there's so many different languages that it is absolutely impossible for us to be able to communicate to one another. Nadia, I went to Samara, Russia, and I never understood a single word they said. And if it was not for the translator, they would never have known anything that I would say. See, we are able to understand we're not all looking the same or sounding the same. Why? These two chapters will explain that. And let's take first chapter 10. The answer to the question of where do we all come from, even with our different looks, our different places, and our different languages, is because of Noah's 3 sons. Now, this is really nice when the Bible does this for us. All right, I want us to look first at verse 1 and then jump all the way to verse 32. They serve as very convenient bookends to explain to us everything that is between them. Verse 1 of chapter 10, Moses wrote, "Now these are the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood." Jump over to verse 32, the last verse in this chapter. "These are the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations by their nations, and out of these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood." I love it because whatever's sandwiched between these two verses is just explaining to us what these two verses are telling us that they're teaching. If you're a teacher, you love it when the notes tell you this is what it's for. And that is indeed what is taught to us in Genesis chapter 10. We are to conclude and to understand that the families from Noah's sons, in one sense, are the fountainhead of all humanity. Likewise, if we were to take the time, and you can listen to others, I listened to Pastor John MacArthur's exposition of this passage, and he goes to incredible detail about where today people can understand, if you're from a certain geographical region, you could trace yourself to one of these sons of Noah. I'm not going to do that this morning. But that's the point of Genesis 10. See, one of the answers to the question, who are you from, is I am from Adam. But another answer to that question is you are from one of the 3 sons. You are either a descendant of Japheth, you are a descendant of Ham, or you are a descendant of Shem. That's what Genesis 10 is teaching us. Verse 32 makes that very clear. Moses composed this complete genealogy of Noah's sons, and one of the ways that he purposefully arranged what is included here is according to sevens. We'll see some of that. I'll narrate quickly how you're seeing that he is making choices to show that 7 is an organizing feature to indicate the completeness of this genealogy. And at the end, if we were to add up all of the nations that are from it, we would get 70. In a similar way that when we come to the end of Genesis and we see from Jacob's descendants, how many will pass out of Egypt? 70. So it's indeed the way it was, but I don't think it's meaning that these are all of the descendants, by name, sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, but he is selecting on purpose these in order to give to us a complete genealogy of the nations that trace their origin back to these three sons of Noah. It explains to Noah's original readers who are the people in the land. Going into Canaan, you're going to face people, and they are not going to act like God commands you to act. Where are they from? Well, they're not from a different genetic line, ultimately from you. They're also from one of the sons of Noah. But they are going to be absolutely, or at least they should be, absolutely different to you because they do not come from Abraham's line. We'll see how Genesis 10 and 11 bring us to this point. Well, three sons are given in the list. We were introduced to those three sons in verse 1. And then you see that they're divided and they do not receive equal attention. You're able to see in verses 2 through 5, it's Japheth's sons that are given there. 14 names are listed, 7 of Japheth's sons, 7 of his grandsons. In case you're wondering, that's what son means in this genealogy. It is saying these are the descendants of this son of Noah. Next, in verse 6 through 20, we are given a great deal of information about Ham's sons. This also mixes his sons and his grandsons. 4 sons are given. Then his grandsons are given, and Cush's son is also given special attention. And then we come to one of the sons of Ham, Nimrod. I want you to come down and see that in verse 8, we are introduced to the son of Cush. Because Cush was the father of Nimrod. And read with me about Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth, and he was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh and the land of Shinar. We'll see Shinar in chapter 11. From that land, he went out to Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth it and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. See, one of the things that the genealogy of the peoples as they fall from these three sons of Noah is that they are going to be like their fathers unless God intervenes. Now, we will go more into the land of Shinar in the first 9 verses of Genesis 11, and it will give us the origin story of the great and sinful kingdom. But we learn here that it is Nimrod who was the leader of this great sinful city. From Nimrod, we are able to see that Mizraim is the next son, and he is followed by his sons. These are also Ham's grandsons, and there are 7 of them. And then in verses 15 through 19, Sidon is the next. He was the firstborn of Ham, also known as Canaan. And his other sons and those people who come from them are listed here. And here the terms are the terms that Moses would have been able to identify these people by. Obviously, that enables us to understand that the book of Genesis is not, in one sense, primarily interested in giving us like the primeval history, but rather it is giving us a theological history of the origins of the peoples. When Moses wrote this, Israel needed to understand who they are and who are the nations. And we too need to understand who are we and what are the nations. Attention in verse 19, you'll see, is given to the border of Canaanite, that it extends from Sidon as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, as you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. Now, why would he all of a sudden be interested not in the descendants, the sons, but rather in the land? Well, we're going to see in chapter 12, why indeed knowing the land in which they inhabited is so significant. Because in God's promise to Abraham, this land will be given to Abraham. And thus we'll see continual conflict between the dividing nations, one on the basis of God's redemptive promise, and two on the basis of rebellion against God. The land, in one sense, is the theater of the war between the redeemed and the rebellious. In verses 21 through 31, we see Shem's sons. This is the line of grace, or the line of God's favor. It's not because Shem's sons are any different from these other sons. There's nothing superior about their genealogy. I mean, their genes. There's nothing superior about their moral decisions, but they indeed are going to be the line that God graciously chooses to redeem and to bring the promise of redemption to all the other nations. In verse 21, Japheth and Shem are associated together because they were the two sons that Noah blessed, because they were the two sons who did not look upon their father's nakedness, but rather covered it. And so their association is clear for us in verse 21, which is opposed to Ham. We are also introduced to Eber, and he is the focus of Shem's sons in this narrative. In this genealogy. And this is because in verse 25, we're able to see that Eber is going to have two sons. One of the sons, verse 25 says, was Peleg, for in the days of the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Those out of the genealogy here, those are the two sons that we will need to pay attention to. For Abraham will come from one of the sons of Eber, Peleg. But the other, Joktan, will bring yet another iteration of the people and city opposed to God, Babylon. Altogether, chapter 10 forms from these sons and grandsons 70 peoples, 70 nations. And so it's called the Table of Nations. And this is Moses's complete explanation of the world that Israel inhabited. But I would want you to also know, while we would have to add quite a bit of names to derive the particular peoples and nations of our day, yet still we come from this same table of nations. We would have a much longer list of the sons and grandsons that as they come from these three sons of Noah, but indeed it's just an extension of the same table. And what indeed is very sobering about the conclusion of this table of nations is that at their end, we learn in chapter 11, none of them please God. They all will be a united people, and in their unification and great power, they rebel. So right away, Christian, I just want you to know that when you answer the question, who are you from? And you turn to Genesis chapter 10, and you are also able to answer who everybody else is from. One thing that you're not able to do is to say there's one group of people who are ethnically superior, racially different from any other group of people. And the manifestation of the equal moral ruin of all of the descendants of these three sons is, where do they end up by the time we come to chapter 11? While Ham's line exceeds them in sin, all the sons and their descendants from Noah do not fear God. They do not believe God. They do not walk in his ways. Now, quickly, we need to do a little bit of math. Next month, I turn 49. My mother, Malia, I believe she's 78. Is that correct? Her mother died when she was 103. I conversed with my grandmother, who lived at the time where veterans of the war between the states walked the earth. Do you see? That's not that long ago. These sons of Noah's three sons had living testimony of the flood. That they were not reading about it in a book. They actually had people that they knew through the overlap of these generations of God's great and mighty hand of judgment and his merciful deliverance of the three sons that they're all from. And yet they did not trust God. They did not fear God. They did not believe God. So if you were tempted in any way to think whoever out of these three sons you call your ethnic heritage, and to think that somehow there is intrinsic to them a nobility before God, you cannot read your Bible worth anything. There is no line of Noah's sons that have any kind of moral merit before God, that God would choose them, God would favor them, that God would bless them. They now have done what all sinners do. They have degenerated. But degeneration in sinful man, we now learn in chapter 11, doesn't mean that it becomes unsophisticated. It can. And you can read about some of the descendants from Noah's three sons that indeed have degenerate cultures. Pick up John Patton's autobiography and read about the islands that we now call Fiji, and read of their behavior before that bold Scottish Presbyterian missionary preached the gospel to them. That's degenerate culture. But there is also a form of degenerate, idolatrous, godly society that is sophisticated, unified, incredibly powerful. And in chapter 11, we see the first iteration of Shem's, how we'll come to see that Shem's sons will be the line of blessing in Abraham. But this indeed is not because any of these sons are good. So first, in order for us to get to the line of blessing where God chooses Abraham, we have to learn about how God did bring about the nations to different places and to speak different languages, and it comes through God's judgment. Babylon is judged by God. But Babylon, we read in verse 1, arises in this first unified enterprise of rebellion against God when there was one language and one people from all of Noah's sons. Verse 1, now the whole earth had the same language and the same words. If you're wondering what you could just imagine what would enable people to be able to be more effective to accomplish the desires of their hearts, then what you need to do is make sure everyone speaks the same language and make everyone belong to the same group of people. Every empire that emerges, that indeed lesser versions, if you will, of this first iteration of Babylon, they have the same features. One of the things that you're able to see in the Roman Empire is not only was there a relative peace in the Roman Empire, but there was also a common language that they could speak. They were united under the Roman Empire, and in that sense, it makes for a great deal of power to be given to that particular empire, to those particular people, especially to those leaders. In this particular point in the history of the world, there is one people and one language. They are very efficient to accomplish their heart's desire. And here, in that sense, this singular language, this singular people indicates mankind's power. And such a people, in such a circumstance, all you need is a Nimrod that can organize, unite, and lead the people to accomplish what is their heart's desire. We have already seen that Nimrod was such a man, and Nimrod was the leader that moved the one people with one language with great efficiency in rebellion against God. See, that's what follows next is mankind had this great power, same language, same words, but they also had an evil desire. This is going to be indicated for us in ways that might not be clear to us. First, in verse 2, when we read that it happened that they journeyed east. Now, by chapter 11, we should be picking up on some significance in the direction that people go. In what direction did God cast Adam out of Eden? East. In what direction did Cain find his exile to face him? East. When you move east in the Old Testament, you are moving away from God. You are moving out of his presence. You do not want to be associated with God's presence and God's place. And so the direction that they are journeying indicates the disposition of their hearts. Now, let's just be honest. How beautiful and almost sublime is that same reality today? At some level, there's reason for me to think you came to church today. Like you made a decision to go in this direction to this place. And I have reason to think you're at least making one good decision. And it's also absolutely sound to be able to see people who are going in other directions to where they choose both literally with where they choose to associate and whom they choose to associate, that they're going in a direction that is opposed to God. So we speak to people that way. Son, I want you to know you're going in the wrong direction. The course that you are traveling is opposed to God. You are moving away from his people, away from his presence. You need to wake up, son. We should talk that way. Well, that's exactly what was taking place with all of the descendants as they were one people from the sons of Noah. They were not divided yet, and so they were together united to be moving away from God. They were journeying east, and they found a plain. We already referred to that plain, the land of Shinar. That's where Nimrod was so effective as a leader of these people opposed to God. The other thing is we're able to see their hearts, not only in the direction that they traveled, but also in sort of kind of the anthems that they used for themselves. We are able to read repeatedly in verses 3 and 4. Let us, let us, let us. This is what united peoples do. I mean, let it not be lost on us that Americans, every single time we have election, these potential leaders politically, they're going to give some other version of a let us. Uniting people in accomplishing the desires of their heart. Well, these people's desires of their heart was to live opposed to God. And so their anthem that called them is they actually wanted to do something that would be opposed to God and for their own glory. And so they said, let us build for ourselves two things, a city and a tower. Now, this is contrary. What did God command after the flood for Noah and his sons to do? The same thing he commanded Adam and Eve to do. You're to multiply and you're to fill the earth. But what do they want to do? They want to make for themselves a city and a tower. A tower, it would be some version of a ziggurat, which would be a great tower, which not literally was seeking to go to the heavens, but rather indeed symbolized that their relationship to God was manifested by the idol that would be atop of the ziggurat that made the connection between God or the gods and the stars and them. At the base of that ziggurat, there would be temples that they could commit various forms of idolatry and formal worship. And so they built a tower. That's what the Tower of Babel was. But the city itself is also what they built, and that would be Babylon. That is the desire of their heart. They do not want to do what God has commanded them to do, to multiply and fill the earth. What they want to do is to exalt themselves, and so they set out with their great power to accomplish the desires of their hearts, to build for themselves a city and a tower, to make for themselves, it reads, a name for ourselves. They did not want to be the image of God born as they married and filled the earth with their children for God's name, rather for their name. So they cooperated and communicated with great efficiency, and they built themselves this city and the tower. Indeed, this is Babylon, the first of many iterations of the same sort of spirit of a city that is set against God. It is opposed to God's purposes, and it was built for that purpose. It also makes it very clear that this was their desire because they give the reason that they wanted to build this city. The last clause in verse 4 is, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. What did God command them to do? Fill the whole earth. God now visits them. Every time in the Bible that we are going to see when God comes down, you need to understand two things could happen. When God comes down, it either will be of judgment, which it normally is, or it may be in redemption. Sometimes they're joined together. That salvation is accomplished through judgment. But it is necessary to note that after the fall, when God visits, there should be fear of judgment for sinful man. And that indeed is what happens. We read that God said, And then Yahweh came down, verse 5, to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And Yahweh said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. This actually is the nature still today of all humanity. That in one sense, if you could take as diverse and different as the nations or the peoples are today, if you could unite them, then this would be their unified heart's desire. And a new Nimrod could come on the scene. And they would be willing to be led by a Nimrod in order to make for themselves a name in a city and idolatry. This will continue throughout the Old Testament to be the work of the nations, but this will continue to be what is happening in our day and age as well. The technology that they possess, bricks, would be used not to serve God and to love neighbor, but it would be sought to make a great name for man and to commit idolatry. So too, technology continues to be used by mankind to build cities that are not for the glory of God and the good of man, but are for the vain glory of man and for the incredibly sophisticated and monetized form of sin and idolatry. So what does God do? God, in his judgment, as well as in his gracious plan of redemption, God now chooses to do what he often chooses to do, and that is he ironically turns the table. You might remember what enabled them to achieve this great city and tower. One language, one people, in one place. So we are able to read that what God does in order to frustrate the sinful plans of man and to accomplish the plans of God, verse 7, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's language. Verse 8 then adds, so Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So what God's judgment does, in one sense, it is just and right, but it also is gracious, because in one sense, we need to understand this about ourselves and the nation still today. The more inefficiencies that you build into human beings being able to accomplish the desires of the heart, the more difficult it is for sin to be unified and sophisticated in man's rebellion against God. Understand, I live in my head, I live in like 200 years ago. They really don't apply to the world as it is today. But I simply would want you to just observe from the nature in which our own union of 50 states now is to operate, that it is by design supposedly impossible for another state to tell another state what they are to do. Now, we've had some hiccups along the way, and even now our Supreme Court is having to decide, can West Virginia decide that if you're born a boy, you can't play girls' sports? But our country was designed understanding this. If you build in inefficiencies for people to accomplish their heart's desire through rule and through a society, then it will be more difficult for them to actually create transgressive institutions, cities, towers. So what did God do to frustrate the one people with the one language in the one place? He confused their language so that instantaneously and supernaturally they all spoke different languages. And secondly, supernaturally, he scattered them over the face of the earth. That put an absolute kibosh on a one world government opposed to God. Now, Satan is a stubborn loser, and he is continuing to run the same play. But nonetheless, you are able to see it is an old play. But God's judgment, as well as his grace, visits and brings a reversal, ironic as he is, by confusing their language and scattering them across the whole earth. So how did it go? When they used all of their ability and technology under a great and wicked leader, Nimrod, how did it go for them? They built the city so that they would not be scattered over the face of the earth in verse 4, and yet in verse 8, they are scattered over the face of the whole earth. See, in that sense, here we're going to learn something that is going to go forward as we eventually get to the promise to Abraham. There is going to seem as if there is constant victory of those people who are opposed to God. But it will be overturned. It will be overturned by God's judgment and his gracious redemption. God indeed is going to bring forth his great city through his promised seed from Abraham's line. That is Jesus of Nazareth. And the city is the New Jerusalem. And you can go to Revelation chapter 21 and 22 and see how indeed it ends after the nations opposed to him have been destroyed. But verse 9 concludes, therefore its name is called Babel. This is onomatopoeia. The name of the city sounds like what they now were doing. They were babbling to one another, unable to understand one another. When a baby babbles, they're making noises that indeed, I'm sure they're saying something, but we sure have no idea what they're saying. That's what God now had made their great city. It now is called Babel because Yahweh confused the language of the whole earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them over the face of the whole earth. He turns now to the generation of Shem. We won't read those, but we'll get to the conclusion because we follow and we see that there is a division among Shem's descendants that relate to Peleg, verse 18. From him comes one Nahor, who fathers Terah. And in verse 26, we are told that Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And now the narrative is interested in the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of Terah, his father, in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, the father of Iscah. And Sarah was barren. She had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot his son of Haran, Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to go to the land of Canaan. And they came as far as Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah was 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. The table of nations now comes to a single point, and we are interested in one son from the descendants of all of Noah's three sons. He's called Abram at the end of chapter 11. Next week, we will meet him in chapter 12. Who are you from? You are from Adam. You possess the dignity as an image bearer of God. But you are also from Adam, and you are a sinner. That your people, no matter what they look like and what they sound like and where they're from, they have in their heart opposition to God. Who do you need to be from? You need to be from, in one sense, the people of the second Adam, who is Jesus of Nazareth, who will be the promised descendant of Abraham, who will bring the blessing of forgiveness of sin to all of the nations. If you do not have Abraham's son, Jesus of Nazareth, as the one who represents you before God, then you need to know him. If you'd like to talk more about knowing Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, come and talk to me after Chris leads us in a song and benediction. We'll go to chapter 12 of Genesis next week.